This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 600 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to remind you about the FanDuel Sunday Million Contest. The prize pool is a whopping $1.25 million, with first place taking home $250,000 this week. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and click on the NFL Sunday Million Contest. Draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy some Sunday NFL football. Go to FanDuel.com today to participate in the NFL Sunday Million. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. It's a waiver wire focused 15 transaction show today because that's what matters most this time of year. So let's get to it. Sell the Miami Dolphins backfield. So this past week, the Dolphins had some COVID-related issues in their backfield. At first, we thought that maybe Phillip Lindsay was going to be the lead back, and then maybe it was going to be Malcolm Brown. With Myles Gaskin then playing, everyone figured that Myles Gaskin was going to have a big day against the Jets. But no, it was Duke Johnson. Johnson handled 68.8% of the team's running back rushes this past week. That was the fifth highest mark by any Miami running back this season. He had 22 carries for 107 yards and a pair of scores. But let's give this some context. It was against the Jets. When looking at schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed by position, New York against running backs has been the most advantageous matchup in fantasy this year. On the season, they've allowed about 11 more points to be scored on them versus their opponent's season-long averages. So let's say a team walked in to face the Jets and that team's backfield averaged 15 fantasy points per game. Against the Jets, we'd expect that team backfield to score over 26 fantasy points. Over the next 2 weeks for Miami, they get the Saints and the Titans. Those teams rank 32nd and 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs this year. They're tough matchups. And then on top of that, because Duke Johnson's big game, what if the Dolphins just added another head to that backfield? It's just honestly a mess. And with those two matchups, I would not be wanting to rely on any Miami running back from here on out. Add Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I talked about St. Brown last week, but over his last three now, he's seen target shares of 31.6%, 32.4%, and 42.3%. He's gotten 12, 12, and 11 targets over his last three games, and he's finished as a top 10 wide receiver in two of those contests. Like I always say, you need to buy volume in fantasy football. St. Brown is getting that volume. I don't care what offense he's in if he's seeing 12 targets a game. And not only that, but in Week 16, Detroit has a pretty good matchup against Atlanta. So definitely add Amon-Ra St. Brown this week if he's still out there. Add Craig Reynolds. So this past week, things really didn't go that well for the two running backs on top of Detroit's depth chart. DeAndre Swift, he has a shoulder injury. He wasn't able to go in Week 15. And Jamal Williams is dealing with COVID-19. That allowed Craig Reynolds to once again lead that Detroit backfield. And he saw a better running back rush share in Week 15 than he did in Week 14. In Week 14, that running back rush share was 58%. This past week, it was 79%. He carried the ball 26 times against Arizona. He had 112 yards on the ground. Now, I will say his role as a receiver has not been very good. Over these two games, he's about a 4.6% target share per game. But let's just pretend that Jamal Williams and DeAndre Swift can't go in Week 16. That means that Craig Reynolds would once again step up and have a good matchup against Atlanta. So I think that you should add him this week, although there is a chance that something happens and things get shuffled in that Detroit backfield. Add Ronald Jones. So if Ronald Jones is on your waiver wire, he's the top priority this week. It sounds like Leonard Fournette's going to miss a game or two with a hamstring injury. And considering the Buccaneers get the Jets in Week 17, why would they rush him back? So you should have the expectation that Fournette is not going to participate in the fantasy football season from here on out. That's just my guess. But you should at least plan for that. And that means that Ronald Jones is in store for a lot of work. And that's work in a very good offense. Now, Fournette had seen a double-digit percentage target share in all but one game this year heading into Week 15. And when Ronald Jones was getting a big workload last year, he wasn't seeing that many looks through the air, at least compared to Fournette. Jones had 10 games last year with 10 or more carries. He ended up with a double-digit percentage target share in just 3 of those games. So don't just assume that Ronald Jones is going to see Leonard Fournette's work. The good news, though, is that Ronald Jones averaged over 22 touches per game without Fournette in 2020. So he's going to see a lot of work. He's just never been that much of a pass catcher, and that's likely why the Bucs opted for Keyshawn Vaughn a bit in that game against the Saints. Both Jones and Vaughn ended that game with 2 targets. So Jones should see a lot of work on the ground. And he should still see some work through the air. I'm not saying he's going to have a 0% target share. We just shouldn't expect him to be Leonard Fournette. Regardless, there's going to be plenty of opportunities. It's a great offense. You need to be adding Ronald Jones. Add Tyler Johnson, Scotty Miller, and Brashad Perriman. So an even bigger injury to the Bucs this week was with Chris Godwin. He tore his ACL. So he's done for the year. And then on top of that, Mike Evans hurt his hamstring. His week 16 is in question right now. Now, fortunately, Tampa Bay is getting Antonio Brown back this week. But these are still brutal blows to this offense. Now, replacing Godwin and maybe Evans will be Scotty Miller, Tyler Johnson, and Brashad Perriman. According to Pro Football Focus, against the Saints, Johnson ran 50 routes, Miller ran 40. And Johnson also played 12 more snaps. But Perriman didn't play because he was out on the COVID-19 list. He could play a role this week as well, and moving forward. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, he ran ahead of both Tyler Johnson and Scotty Miller. But he did take a back seat in week 14 to Tyler Johnson. So what does this all mean? What am I saying here? Who should you prioritize? I would say you should prioritize Tyler Johnson. He's now played more than the other 2 wide receivers over the last couple of weeks. And Chris Godwin plays a lot from the slot. He's played about 70% of his snaps from that area of the field this year. Brashad Perriman's a perimeter player. And then Scotty Miller and Tyler Johnson have both played similar snap rates from the slot this year. But in week 15, Johnson ran 10 more routes from the slot than Scotty Miller did. So that all seems to favor Tyler Johnson, especially if Evans is able to go. Because with Evans, you get Evans and AB on the perimeter and Tyler Johnson in the slot. If Evans can't go, there's a risk for Scotty Miller that Brashad Perriman plays on the perimeter. With Tyler Johnson, I think he's just the slot guy. And with Chris Godwin out, that's why I would prioritize Johnson ahead of the other Buccaneers wide receivers. Add Gabriel Davis. So I talked about Gabriel Davis last week. He was an obvious add with Emmanuel Sanders banged up. And without Emmanuel Sanders in the lineup in week 15, Davis saw 22.6% of Buffalo's targets and he found the end zone twice. He's now scored 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games, and through Sunday's games, he's leading the NFL in red zone targets during this time frame. Gabriel Davis is going to be relevant as long as Emmanuel Sanders is sidelined, because he's seeing a good number of looks and he's seeing highly valuable looks. And honestly, guys, even if Emmanuel Sanders is healthy, it's tough to imagine at this point that Buffalo just makes Gabriel Davis a part-time player once again. Add Samaje Perine. Joe Mixon has been struggling in fantasy football. His highest target share over his last 3 games is just 5.9%. He's failed to get any higher than that in 4 of his last 5. And during this 5-game stretch, Perine has out-targeted him 13-8. Now Mixon is dealing with an ankle injury. At the time of this recording, I don't know if he's going to play this weekend. I don't know the status of that injury in full. But you can't really just wait and see what happens. You have to add Samaje Perine as backup. Because he would see more work on the ground if Mixon is sidelined, and we already know that he can play a receiving role. So it's definitely worth it to get Perine, no matter if you have Mixon or not. Add Marquez Valdez-Scantling. So I've brought up MVS on this show a lot over the last month, but his percent roster number is still just 41% over on Yahoo. MVS has hit a 20% target share in 3 of his last 4 games, and he's finished as a top 10 wide receiver in weekly scoring twice over this time. I know I mentioned that on yesterday's 10 Trend Show, and like I said on yesterday's 10 Trend Show, he's the perfect boomer bust player for underdog teams, for teams needing that boost. There's a player out there in a lot of leagues who's seeing 20% of Aaron Rodgers' targets. You should want that in fantasy football. Add Justin Jackson. So Austin Eckler was dealing with an ankle injury this past week. That led to Justin Jackson seeing a season-high 39.4% running back rush share in that Chargers offense. He had 13 carries and he turned them into 86 yards. Now, there were some conflicting reports on Monday about Austin Ekeler testing positive for COVID-19 or going on the COVID-19 list. At the time of this recording, he's not on that list. But the risk is obviously there, not just with Austin Ekeler, but any player across the league right now. So yeah, you could argue that Justin Jackson could get COVID too. But no one's handcuffing Justin Jackson. Justin Jackson's the handcuff to Austin Ekeler. All relevant handcuffs need to be rostered right now, and that includes Justin Jackson. Add Cole Kmet. Kmet has actually seen a decent target share in 2021. He has a 19% target share this year. And he's coming off a game where he caught 6 of 9 targets for 71 yards. And the Bears get Seattle in week 16. Seattle's been one of the worst teams this year against the tight end position in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Cole Kmet makes a lot of sense as a tight end streamer. Add Justin Fields. And the guy throwing him the rock is Justin Fields, who's been very, very good in fantasy football. Thanks to a late game touchdown against the Vikings, Fields was able to finish as a QB1 in week 15. He now has 4 QB1 performances across his last 4 completed games played. And as I alluded to last week, a lot of that has to do with his increase in rushing. He's now averaging 8.5 rush attempts and over 64 rushing yards per game over this 4-game sample. That's amazing. That's exactly what we want. So I would feel fine streaming him against Seattle this week. Add Jimmy Garoppolo. So I've been talking about Jimmy G a lot on this podcast too. He's been pretty reliable during this second half of the season. He's not producing like a high ceiling, which is why I would still opt for Justin Fields. But Jimmy G has averaged 17.3 points per game since week 8. And he's had a low of 11.2 points. He hasn't sunk your fantasy teams. And against Tennessee this week, a team that ranks 8th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, he makes for a decent streaming choice. Add the New Orleans Saints defense. So the Saints are rostered in 53% of Yahoo leagues. They're not totally a streaming option. But it's week 16, it can't hurt if I just throw out some defensive plays. New Orleans has one of the best schedules for their defense in week 16 and 17. They get Miami in week 16 and then Carolina in week 17. According to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, those are 2 top 10 opponents for an opposing fantasy football defense. FanDuel Sportsbook this week has this game against Miami at a 39-point over-under, and New Orleans is a 3-point home favorite. That alone means that they make sense as a streamer. Hold the New England Patriots defense. So the Patriots get the Bills this week, and Buffalo's a tough matchup. I would understand if some of you don't want to use the Patriots and if you have a better option. Only 3 defenses against Buffalo have finished in the top 10 in weekly scoring this year. And that's why the Bills are a bottom 5 team for opposing defenses to face in adjusted fantasy points allowed. But if you're going to replace New England as a defense, don't drop them. Because in week 17, they get Jacksonville. You absolutely want to use the Patriots against the Jags. So again, it's understandable if you have another defense this week. I don't think the Patriots are like that horrific of a play either. I'm just saying, please don't drop them. Add the Seattle Seahawks defense. So I think the most traditional streamer this week is Seattle. They're decent home favorites against the Bears in week 16. And by the way, if you get Seattle this week, you could even play them in week 17. They get Detroit. Those are 2+ matchups in adjusted fantasy points allowed, and that gives Seattle one of the best schedules in all of fantasy football over the next 2 weeks. The 16 transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com, it's another ad. It's to add James O'Shaughnessy. I've talked about James O'Shaughnessy on my sleeper show throughout the season, and while he's likely not going to be someone that just lights it up in fantasy, he's a reasonable option for tight end streamers. He's averaged a target share per game of over 15% since his return from injury. And in week 16, the Jags get the Jets. It's actually a defense that Jacksonville might be able to move the ball on. Though we said that last week against Houston and we saw how that worked out. But even last week, O'Shaughnessy also caught 4 of his 4 targets for 60 yards. He was a usable tight end. So I think we could see that happen again in week 16, given this matchup. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.